So a session on travels and whatever has been collected amongst those travels. Um, some of them will probably be related to XORG endeavors. I know that there are such things, and we can do this freely in uh, anyone can start of of a particular thing they want to share. Um, if we manage to be ruly and not give time to others, then anybody can note, but I can take also some responsibility of trying to make space for everybody. But we could try to do some this, and we can redesign it along the way. Is once the thing is told, like there's some space for reflections of what could it mean or what could be taken out of there. Can be personal notes, but can also be exorgian reflections. Um, um, but with that said, um, the board is open, the notes are open. Does anybody want to start?
I guess I could start just by saying that there were a lot of conversation on outputs, Sorgen outputs, and how could those take shape into the world and guide our tentacles in productivity.
Yeah, I think you're opening the space for reflections, and this might be something that anybody can also add to of tentacles. But we can go from there. I'm intentionally wanting to keep the space open from not dominating it, so I'm pushing myself back in the line.
Yeah, I think like if I can maybe chip into the pile, the like I think the conversations we had, they were kind of concretizing already quite nicely, and I recall like two main, how to say, dimensions of things that we spoke about. And actually, if I may say so, maybe Pekkorn, we had a chat afterwards in Vienna that maybe I could also throw in. That might be a third such dimension. The most central regard was kind of our kind of core development, such as the oxels and well, we didn't speak so much about the cards, but we did speak about the semioverse, and we did speak about the zero organization. And sorry, and so those would be kind of XORG spinal focus points. And then we spoke about some parts that would somehow be, yeah, almost interfacey type projects. I don't know if should I be detailing those now, or I mean, me or anyone.
I mean, you could summarize, like
Yeah,
if you have them in your mind.
yeah. So that was two things that grew out of discussion there. The first was the inspiration to maybe think about the structuring or structural space of licenses, and possibly also experiment a bit with this, maybe even make something like a license from our side, compose such a thing. Because I think maybe if I can also recap a bit on what I recall from the motivation, was that I think a common theme for the whole event had something to do with interoperability. There were a lot. I can actually show myself again. Clean. So there were some kind of projects, several projects that aimed at making people work together, and they were a bit different kind of variations on how that could be done. With maybe at least some of them, or like maybe that's also something I would bring from my side. Looking a little bit like I want everybody to come into my boat. And then, yeah, I don't know where that came from with the license, but that was something that kind of really felt curious, I guess, for many of us, as it could be kind of a very, how to say, unimposing, unimpressive in that way, kind of way of structuring togetherness in some sort. I think I stop on this point here. Another one was what came through in the conversation that followed a presentation of Pekko's, which I think I should also speak about, which was actually very, very connected to this question. Pekko, you showed this glog, was it not? Kind of as a kind of a universe, a gaming universe that was spawned from somebody making a completely, like, very much boiled down version of of D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, in like basically a 2-page PDF to collect all like the core rules or notes that one would need to play the thing, rather than having a full book for the whole game. Published on a blog. And since when was it? 2004 or what did you say? Or
I think it's something like 2019, 17. It's rather recent.
Okay, but anyway, for some years now, it's kind of grown into a very diverse universe. So that, like a diverse, so to speak, that where people have been pitching into with their own monsters and spells and characters and whatever, and they pop up everywhere. They pop up, some are on GitHub, some are on other blogs, some are in Google Docs, and so it's a very kind of grass field or like fallow landish type of thing. And I think that had something to do with the licenses. Anyway, that after that present, I think Beckwith would be great if you could show that at some point again. That was so inspiring. But after that presentation, Pablo made a comment in view to was it after this presentation? In view to kind of politics, how somehow games we describe always from their mechanics. So we say it's a multiplayer, role-playing, so on, so stuff. But politics we describe from the top kind of impulse, like, okay, Christian conservative or ideological, exactly. So that brought us then to the thing that maybe we can play around with the kind of kit to make politics that would begin from the mechanics rather than from the ideology, right? And then there were several thoughts on how to do that, but I think that was those were the more concrete parts, if I recall correctly.
I would add that. So also we had a presentation which was good but a bit talky, and also it was in the afternoon when everybody was tired because it was kind of exhausting days on Oxels. But in addition, we had this playtesting, which was kind of much more smaller session. But I would kind of draw that as that for me was very positive, or even optimistic is a good word, like in the sense of things working in a very small scale, of people changing the situation with just a couple of words, becoming a move or role, and really kind of, like, for me it's like the proof was what happens with these and how the situation changes. Like suddenly there are different metabolisms and ecosystems in terms of the behavior itself. And this also, like, I think there was talk on this, like well, that approach can make licenses potentially, and this was also like it was kind of connecting also this operational politics, which was the term operational, which came from in this blog session that Martin mentioned. There was a comment from Jeremy, I think, which some of you know, some may don't, but anyway, about operationalized. It wasn't yet politics, but maybe it was culture, but in this way. And then Pablo made a comment right after that, which had something of a more concrete take on this. Don't remember the exact words, but precisely this sort of, rather than starting from ideology, starting from the mechanics. And on the other hand, like I see a bridge between like ultimately these things, and this was also why I was interested in like creative forms of licenses a year ago. But for me, they are simply a symptom if you start to look at this sort of organizational culture, and they kind of need it. They cannot be just doing licenses, but if you can create organization playfully, which I think the session was really pointing to, not that it was the practical session was some kind of proof of everything, but it was doing the things that all were kind of green lights towards actually you can compose an organization and play it, but if you like, let's say, set those things to be more permanent, they become organization. That was like and if you kind of modulate between we want to be playful, we do wacky moves, you're in a kind of playful end. But if you do no, actually we make these moves rather more seriously, they start to resemble organizational moves. And of course there's the whole ground in between them. And for me this was a big part of kind of pointing out this that there is this sort of common line of that one can offer this approach which allows you to compose organizations or games that are behave like organizations. And that is also a kind of a potential starting expression for operationalized politics. Like I can see that you could produce a playful version of a nation in 2 pages from that. But it needs that language. But I do think that experiment kind of pointed towards that.
I will open the floor to those who were not there to see if this made any sense. Otherwise, we can do a better try to explain it.
It does. It does to me. I mean, especially knowing, not by being there, but sort of understanding the context where you were, it makes sense. You know, I wouldn't say that we XORG generally or necessarily engage in talking about politics, for example, in our XORG, but I get where you were. So I get where this is coming from, and yeah, and I like it.
What about others to take the Jakub? Rock was present, but you weren't present in the practical playtesting, sadly. And there's also hello Ruskar in this comment.
So I guess for me the question that's coming up is like politics in what kind of scope or context? Because it seems to, or because I'm not sure like how do you mean like the word politics, if it's kind of like governance or decision-making mechanisms or like another kind of sense, wider sense. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I'd be curious about like what context to imagine or what kinds of politics.
All kinds of politics.
Yeah.
I guess what was interesting about that conversation was thinking of a lot of political movements, particularly on the left, focus on what they do, right? On how they operate. Sort of like, yeah, we're mutualists, we are communists, we are whatever, right? And in that sense, they are expressing an ideology in terms of operations, terms of distribution of power, distribution of agency, basically. And those moves could probably be modularized to the point where you can operate with them in playful ways. So I guess it was a recognition of that, and how we might, that might be useful for Oxels and our work.
Yeah, also to make a concrete example, or try to make one, is so there was a conversation related to this. Is like this is also kind of related to Oxels, because I think they are a good tool of describing this. Is like something like a year ago, I think it was around when the network state was starting to be talked about. Is I had to make this talk on kind of structures of nation state, because the book was so bad. It is still bad. Like how they could be kind of modularized and simplified, and at the same time made more flexible. But if you do that, they actually reveal certain qualities that are not so much present in the current discourse of even DAOs. Like for example, nations have a structure that they're organizations that are made to spawn other organizations, like associations, etc. And they operate with this default role, which is the citizen, and that everybody gets a default role, and this is the interface for the nation. And if you start looking at them like this, they actually kind of have a lot of interestingly quote unquote modern qualities. Like this organization made to spawn other organizations is not really like DAO bread and butter. Um, Yet nations have been doing that for hundreds of years. So, but also like I found this interesting when I had the talk, is I could put this roughly in my mind into kind of Oxel-like structures, like the citizen as a role. It's actually fairly easy. You start to think of, call them moves or rights, but you can also make them kind of playful nations, like and think of very exotic forms. And then Martin had a point in this conversation, this was in the garden, where he said like we could even make like nations that are rather exotic in this sense, that like how do we produce certain kind of like a different way of putting enforcement. Like what happens if we give an enforcement into 20 people, and kind of form this sort of exotic nation forms. Of course, we could also produce things that we think are hopeful, but in this idea of like, if you do a 2-pager that makes a rough structure of nation, but is also already kind of semi-playable draft, that is rather interesting. And I do think like based on this Oxel test, it would be possible. Yeah, so that's semi-concrete at least.
But I would I would also kind of hook into Jakob's question, so that like I mean in the way that we have been thinking about organization in a very open sense, that also politics, like Pablo said, can be in a very open sense. So the kind of I think you could like I could almost think of this kind of wording as, you know, that the title includes the word politics as a conversation starter, or as a way for people to lock into. Like I think it's because it's such an interesting kind of proposition. I think this kind of modularized or operationalized politics, and like not to, from building, not from ideology. And I was thinking also that like if you think of a space that would be run by any number of people, they need to come to terms with their internal politics, so to speak. And that would be also something to play with. And so I think whether one uses the terminology of what we know to be politics, or whether one goes into stuff that is basically political from so to speak, from the ground up. Yeah, I think it can take either form, as long as the projections screen is clear, or like at least in the outset, so that it can start a conversation. And if maybe at this point I can bring in another kind of flavor that I thought came quite through, and please guys jump in how you saw that. I thought that some of these things, or like maybe all of those things that we've now counted, so the operationalized politics, the license idea, of course the auxils, of course the semioverse, of course the organizations, could now be given by us a type of a project status. And I say it in possibly boring known vocabulary for the sake of clarity, and also because we haven't defined anything about it, or found any other name for it. But if we were to say that as a group, these or any other amount of things that we could kind of throw into the arena, would make such a good contour, or make such kind of nice composition, that we could say, okay, let's now, for the coming sessions, for whatever time, maybe even a bit of an extended time, say those are some projects that we want to be working out. Like we want to concretize, we want to find a form for them, we want to give them outward, so that we kind of can use them a bit as kind of navigation support in a sense, and see that we get some of them lifted outward, I think is maybe. Yeah.
I don't know how people feel, but it might be too early now to start setting projects, since we're in a session of sharing travels. It's like a note. We could revisit that maybe towards the end of the session, but it feels like now too jumpy to now start the conversation about setting these as projects. And also there's some things missing from the like the things. So we had this talk, like there was this talk about the auxils have been already mentioned, and like underneath that, how they could produce licenses and this operational politics. That was, and then there is, and this is, you can guilt me on this, there was the play which Pablo and Eva were part, which is the kind of last large session we had, which had this organization written with the 0, or Q was the original, but the 0 is the current candidate. Like you write organization, but you replace the first O with the 0, which is a kind of a take on like what would happen if you had an organization that is kind of one way to say it was auxil capable, but what it really meant that, like, or to take a practical example, is like we could be in a quote unquote room that is created in an RPG style that somebody describes it, and we are there, but that could become part of the organization that others could visit. We could even give rights to it and invite others into it, which could create new instances, which is kind of the sort of like almost like an organization that that is really not just play-like, but has all kinds of play structures. Then that was kind of included in this conversation, and that maybe gives some practice to, or some shred of an idea, since that concept has already been mentioned. But there were others, like the one thing was the semioverse, and maybe here I'll just introduce one seed. Is there was this weird outgrowth which happened quite early in our travels, is that we're having this discussion in the middle of the night on developing something. It was quite kind of adventurous than spontaneously formed, where we had a discussion of like certain approach, which then landed on GPT because it was just present, and we talked about how it has a nature as a language, and then how if we would make a world out of language, it would be very close to it. And then Pablo started writing a prompt that nicely combined much of the discussion, and then he said, hey, I have this ready, should we run it? And then we ran it, and it worked. Like that's the rough way of saying it. It was way more interesting than ChatGPT in normal sense, and way more surprising, which then led to other prompts and branches contributed from various versions of us, or various versions, persons. And it kind of it had a viral quality in the first conference we're in, the collaborative finance, that suddenly you see people playing this game, even though they have no connection to XORG, in quite a big numbers. And this has continued. Like there has been persons who were introduced in PlayDrive, and I'm still getting messages of people who look at my session kind of game. So, well, one key point to mention that we didn't see this Semiverse kind of added to this kind of accidentally, because it seemed to, in some cases, make the game better, even though it's not an established word, which was interesting. Maybe GPT can parse it in a way. But we also had like conversation that as a concept or as an idea, we have enough material to introduce this concept as a kind of offering to the world, possibly as a task that is not too large, you know. Of course, we made it slightly more difficult of saying if we define it, it should be somehow playful. But there were also good talks about this, and this is a kind of easy, light offering of looking at the world as a world of meaning, which works like a setting rather than like traditional world that it becomes composable. Was another topic, and there was also genes, which I'll just now mention, but those were among the topics we discussed as potential XORGian directions.
Yeah, confirmed. I just wanted to make a note on this kind of projection of stuff, or project formulation of stuff. That was not meant as a kind of topic for now to discuss, but that was kind of to maybe for Jakub also in terms of concreteness, or like to give some grip to it, that was a thing that we thought about. It was not made to be now, but it was a consideration surrounding all of these things.
Semi over stuff was pretty crazy. Pretty wild, pretty wild.
Indeed.
For those who haven't played the game, you should totally play it. Like this will just make sense if you. Yeah, like it's like I don't know, describing it is less fun than just like try it. Oh, but if But
Yeah, I figured you need ChatGPT 4. Like
you
the
do. That's the thing.
3.5 is not, yeah, it kind of explains the rules. It doesn't give you moves. Like it's not working.
Yeah.
You have to pay for 4, right?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
this game is 20 euros a month. Sorry.
That's for sure.
That sucks. We should try like
Worth
a
it.
ChatGPT for all GPT for all fork, and maybe figure out if you can run it locally, and I don't know.
Yeah, I tried doing that. Doesn't work. It's like it's so slow that like it just doesn't work. Yeah.
That's a shame.
Like hours will pass and you still won't get your response, kind of slow.
Yeah, unfortunately, this 20 euros is not going to us. So it's something we cannot forfeit. But it was interesting also as a kind of reflection of, like, it's almost like traveling to the Sevier-verse direction. I mean, it was other things as well, but it had that quality as well. And then like the sort of weird mutations of what meaning is that came through it were interesting.
Yeah, it revitalized a lot of energy in different directions that I had left dormant for a bit. So yeah, it was really cool.
I think it was also a sign that, like, if we take this, I mean, development is a blunt word, but kind of making stuff kind of attitude. It was interesting that it kind of, in a kind of a light way, formulated to something concrete, and also kind of branched out, but branch out in a constructive manner, not fragmented.
Mhm.
And maybe that is a sign of something, of a quality of or capability of that. Have we run out of seeds? Probably not. There's something at the
Yeah.
bottom of the back of, or our backs.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, like aside from the thing I'm always talking about, yeah, I don't know. Just the code is doing well. It's being tended to. And yeah. I don't know. Things are just looking good. Other people are helping with development now too. Um, yeah.
And one thing I keep on going back to, and maybe I will do it again, is the pressure or collective pressure of just having our oxels, having a place where we can all just work on our oxels, expand the oxels we have a database that can be adapted to any kind of interface. Like we could port it to the cards interface that Rusgar is working on. We could print them if we're going somewhere and we want to play with them in printed form. We could have them in a website in a playful way, but we could also have it in a wiki or whatever. But just that we have a simple collective place where we flesh out our oxels. That would be for me amazing.
Yeah, like a game. Let's do that game commons library thing.
I was also going to mention Rock. Maybe if Rock, you're there and you want to maybe say something, because there were some nice sessions or nice ideas also brought up from your side.
Yeah, I was thinking of either having some workspace, shared workspace, and get a group going of people interested in both game commons and Anticipedia, those angles. I'm not really sure what's the best way to start, and what kind of overlaps with this group or not. I mean, definitely game commons, and its overlaps with, like, yeah, gems and organizational structures, games, and so on. So yeah, for sure, like that. But then Yeah, I'm thinking like game commons more in general, the platform and its conception, and also its interface with the Game Changers game. And then yeah, Anticipedia is a whole other thing, but many lessons can be used for that from the game commons.
What, so like when you say shared space, what do you mean?
Yeah, precisely.
Mhm. I mean, one pursuit that comes out of there is like you were already talking about, like how game commons and Anticipedia can use the same infrastructure most likely. And I wrote down to the note that in a way Oxels could be partaking or branching into out of the game commons as kind of organizational commons, because they're really kind of it's very likely that they could use also a similar form, but maybe it's a kind of supportive form for the game commons. It's also like organizational commons, which is kind of also potentially operational politics. Um, because I do think there is that use. Um, I think it's maybe too abstract now, but going to the practical moments on the kind of practical playtest, like when somebody creates a move called, there was a pauser and offering time, two moves, which then became like the pauser was like it first we actually kind of played with this thing that should have a better word, but sometimes called like dynamic ambiguity or ambiguity in general, which is kind of the mist-like approach from XORG earlier. But this idea that we can play something even if we know very little about it, and it can detail itself later. So, for example, the move poser, to take a simple example, was like it was only those two words, move and poser. But then when it was played, it was like, oh, if you play this move, whoever is holding it, or maybe it's available for everyone, you can say now an X time of pausing, which could be like 10 seconds of silence, and then you have to have the etiquette of not stretching it too long. But of course, if you wanted to make it more serious, less playful, you could say like you have this move maybe 3 times, or it's available for everybody for whatever times in a meeting, and it's between 0 to 30 seconds. Like all of these details can kind of be chiseled like a sculpture from the play itself, and as you add more details, it becomes maybe more um, uh, generally usable. But also, you can already play it with just those two words and figure out what happens in the play. And the move offering time was 3 words, like just that when it was played. But then it became this that I think it was Martin that made it, and you proposed like certain take on what happens next in like a process. Can't quite remember the details, but it was a certain kind of time that we would play, and because it was offering time, it was more by general acceptance that this new form of what would happen in the next 5-ish minutes was accepted, and once again that could be detailed later. But all of these are kind of like, in a way, call them exotic or creative takes on elements that happen in traditional organizations. They're not the usual cases, but they have the structures that they share with the usual cases, but just with more modularity and expressibility. Oh yeah, gemetics also.
There were more of those words. Gemetics, what else?
Genealogy,
Chemistry.
chemistry, gemesis. Mm,
Genealogy was really good. Oh my god.
yeah, the kind of words which is also true of XORG itself and Oxel as well, that you can make, like, they have such a kind of natural form that you can, oxalization, which we've used earlier, but it's an example of the same. Um, we also use Sorgian, but these are useful because they kind of create this sort of mapping of a palette. So I think there is some interesting power in their playfulness.
So is this like a recollecting of thoughts call? Is that what's happening?
Oh yes, since you came along the way, the loose structure is like sharing of memories, experiences, like potential seeds that might build to further possibilities, and then giving some time to speculate upon them. That's the loose structure, and anybody can insert such things. So that's
Cool.
anything to share from also elsewhere. I mean, we've been sharing from this travels part of Austria, etc. But that's not the only context, and anybody could have found something that might be interesting.
I mean, when I read the sort of the word license, it made me think a lot. I'm kind of course, as many others, stuck in my writing. I'm finally writing the PhD thesis. And as part of that protocol I was mentioning that I'm developing, I've looked into I'm extensively into sort of licenses, as in like legal frameworks, those that are accepted, but also more experimental stuff. So sort of just opposing the two. So things by UK law on how to organize, how to license work, and I put everything under Figma thing that I don't know what it's going to become because I'm a terrible designer. I'm actually not. That's why. But in the sort of more experimental one, I came across as was something fairly recent from the sort of the whole, I don't know if you know them, I don't, the whole Serpentine team, sort of Ivanova and that people, things about plural property, which is something quite interesting. And I can post a link to papers about it. So, which is also related to radical exchange people. But they did something about sort of common ownership type of thing, which I will copy because it might be relevant to this idea of licenses. So something that, yeah. So just to say that I definitely looked into it. I've been looking into licenses, sort of Creative Commons stuff as well over the past month.
There might be actually a practical comment. I could give you some tips, like the creative use of licenses, especially in games, is actually kind of decades old practice. Like the open gaming license was born like as a version from the GNU public license even before Creative Commons, and the there is like interesting practices if you start digging down into the fringes, like sometimes like people creating rather unusual licenses. And also like that there's also a very serious creative side of licensing. Like now there is this whole like a new batch of licenses. There's the XORG license, which is made by actually heavy duty legal firm, but it's very much about new creation fields. And one of the things I don't know the plural property how it's as a concept, but the basic structure that is like being sought is this, like you create something but by using some licensed rules, and that means that you give your rules to the same space. So you have this continuous field, like an ecosystem growing from people developing and being able to use the mechanics of a game, but meanwhile contributing ever new things. And these license structures are now, I mean, they have been a part of development for almost 20 years, but now there is a serious pathway of developing that forward, which is kind of like almost like a pool of ownership, but in a kind of commons way, but also its own way. And maybe as a final comment, like I find this interesting for several reasons. One of them is like, even though it's not talked about, licenses are actually kind of organizing units, that if you make a license, and I don't know any license of exactly this, but if you make a license that it says that you are free to use it, but whenever you use it, you should send, say, like comments or log or report of its usage to a certain place. This is completely legally and otherwise doable as a license structure. What you're already doing is you're organizing people. And this is not by accident, because they are naturally, even the traditional licenses, organizing units. So you simply have to kind of look woods for the trees and then start using that capability of creating this sort of like a distributed thing that starts to organize people from its distribution, which, like, looking at that angle makes them highly interesting as kind of other take of organizing.
Do you have any, what was the name that you said about this license in games? I kind of missed it.
I can give you examples, but there is the XORG license, which is written like orc, but I would add the search as orc license, so you'll find it. It's a
yeah.
It's a kind of a serious approach, but there is actually underneath it a lot of smaller licenses. I can try to find you links of and then there is, I'll just add this shortly because I can put it in a larger form in some other context. There's this new discussion on, because people have tried to make and made licenses that are like no Nazis, as for example, that if you're part of this in this party, you cannot use this. And there is structural problem with such licenses, because like, who checks this, and who is the actually governing form of saying this usage was bad or not? And suddenly you end up in this sort of like needing of a governance space. So many people, even like anti-Nazis, have gone to say that this is not really a functional practice to do it this way. But then there's this new kind of like extra license discourse, which is creating these best practices. Like, here's a license, and here's how we are going to use it, and suggest you to use it, which is then removes the necessity of governance, but kind of creates this sort of common policy or discourse on policy, which is a whole developing field. I've seen just in the last year the first cases of people taking stab at these kind of things, and it's rather interesting as a development.
Yeah, that's as well, I think, what I found the website of the partial common ownership talks about, because of course, I mean, originally licenses were used to gatekeep, content ideas or whatever, again, to, yet another sort of copyright. But of course, I mean, if you're thinking about us sort of thinking through experimenting with licensing, that's definitely something that interests me, like how to keep, as you said, the license open so that is actually a fertile tool rather than gatekeeping even more. I mean, that would be really cool. But then equally as well, like recognize, I mean, there's a lot to think for about, again, sort of like, I mean, if you think at large, the whole idea of property, well, yes, you know, if it's tricky because then, of course, this, you know, you can have this vacuum where you don't really know, as you said, sort of not who's in charge, but who manages what belong. I'm not sure if I'm explaining myself. I'm a bit burned from the heat.
You're doing well enough, like no problem.
You know what I mean? Like this sort of this communist dream of like everything belongs to everyone, and which, I mean, on an ideological level might be great, but we all know that it doesn't really work practically, you know? So it's that space of, which is interesting to me, like if we work on that space, basically.
Okay, I will abstain from my desire of nerdery and make a super short summary of what is the kind of strategy of making licenses creative. I went to a legal rabbit hole and found actually like the way they work, they don't actually challenge copyright. They actually accept copyright. Like copyright happens. Whoever made the thing gets all the copyright. They don't challenge that at all, but rather they take, okay, good, I got the copyright. Now I become the new distributor, and the license does the distribution after the copyright has happened. And this is actually from all the way from GNU license legal figurings of how do we do this. And it's the basis of Creative Commons, this approach. They use the same approach, but it's like it's a very useful approach because it actually makes the license space much more lighter and much more creative. Okay, now I stopped the nerdery, but I know how the structure now works and have a sense of how to utilize it.
So I'm just thinking about this whole like utilizing the state thing, and like, you know, having it implement other protocols like this license and stuff. But I'm also thinking about like, well, if we're trying to use the state's force to be able to, you know, make sure that the license is maintained or whatever, then there's got to be some like way of doing like a legal recourse, right? And if that's the case, then like in conjunction with this license, it would be nice to have the ability to like, I don't know, have like a legal DAO or something, I don't know, in that could help people enforce the license.
There is actually a trick to this. I'm continuing my nerdery, sorry everybody. So the trick is, like, for example, you can use certain Creative Commons licenses that you build on top of them. So you already accepted the copyright. Then you accept the distribution of the Creative Commons and certain forms of it you can build on top of them. While this might seem like a hairy hairball, but ultimately people only have to care what's on top. And this allows you that you have the legal backing of first the state because you accepted copyright, then the Creative Commons. And therefore, like if you make the right moves on top, you already have a legal backing. Okay, I'll shut up now again.
I personally don't particularly like creating structures that rely on, like, ultimately you're relying on state violence to be enforced, right? Like, oh, if you don't follow this, there's legal threats, right? So I'm thinking if there is a possibility of having a non-state license that is enforced other ways, I don't know, socially or yeah, it's a place we could think about, but it's not so exciting to me to be creating structures that plug into
relying on, yeah, the state's monopoly on violence, basically.
I mean, that's understandable. That's also like all the Creative Commons are relying on, but it's an interesting out of the box thought of how to do it differently. The thing is, how law works, I'll summarize this again, is it still retains the possibility of enforcement. Like it doesn't recognize something that is external to it. Like what happened with DAOs, like in the last 2 weeks, is their structuring was simply not recognized. Like the DAO structure, like this was the whole legal kerfuffle that the whole DAO was taken into court, and their right to self-organize was simply put aside because we recognize what we recognize, and you are not recognized, therefore this organization does not exist. And this was a kind of predefining case for DAOs in general. DAOs are not, in at least in certain sense of law, like US, but probably elsewhere as well, not recognized as organizations, and this was sort of expected actually. And that's the problem, is like even if you start from self-organizing, you're not out of the enforcement because of how law works.
I mean, maybe we could operate in a more abstract sort of space and connect this with the operational politics. So if we unpack sort of the mechanics of politics, which I sort of think about, like, really sort of thinking through the pillar of decision-making, governance, and so forth, and see or envision new ways for them to operate that are speculative at this stage, then maybe we could also, within this politics, think about alternative version of state power.
Mm-hmm. I think, yeah, that's also like, I mean, it's almost like a micronation path. Like you just claim it.
Or it's, yeah. Sorry.
Do say.
No, it seems to me very similar to the aspirations of the like different commons or like commoning kinds of frameworks, because one of the principles is like trying to retain autonomy and modularity and flexibility of like developing own governance, but at the same time creating and negotiating interfaces with the higher levels of organizations, and therefore getting recognized, and therefore getting the ability to actually interact and be seen, and perhaps even get enforcement on other functions or operations. So it seems to me that this is like a commons or commoning discourse, parallel or overlap in some ways.
Yeah, and commoning actually faces similar situation as say DAOs. Like often kind of commoning structures are recognized by the legal organization if they have such, like they have a cooperative say, that's their recognition. But now I'm getting like nerdy and boring, and like while things I say might have some useful knowledge, I'm being a Debbie Downer.
For me, this is super interesting at this point, so I don't find it boring, but I don't know how others.
Agree. Same.
This is great.
Yeah, sometimes there's usefulness of like for creating the kind of codex, and before the spacer, I did a lot of comparison with like what are the kind of principles functionality of law, which is highly interesting because some of them are highly useful also. And I certainly don't claim like super expertise of this field because it's nobody really has that, but just like the sort of operational parts of law are highly, mechanics of law are interesting and useful. But I do think like really to remove my Debbie Downerness is like this whole area in itself, like creating this kind of forms is also part of discourse, like part of like communicating for people that other possibilities exist. Like, for example, if to concretize from here, it would be cool to have a session to take this, like what's really underneath nations. Like it's not too much. It's actually, I mean, if you want everything, then it's like nearly practically infinite. But if you want like what are the basic pieces, you can put them in a fairly simple order. Like you need this, like, okay, citizen actually auxilized becomes a role, and citizen is made out of rights. So it's already very compatible with auxilized expression, but then you can make it kind of playable, etc. And this whole possibility of setting, oh, you have this right in this context, it's also kind of how the world works. Like, why do you have certain rights in an organization is that there is a context of this organization that recognizes your further rights, which you don't have outside of that organization. It's actually kind of like the structures underneath are super modular, but how we have written our laws and how we have kind of approached this over centuries really have made them much more stiff than they could be. And that is highly interesting in itself. Also, there's sort of like, oh, we make an organization that creates certain frameworks of creating other organizations or sub-organizations is super flexible, can be made super flexible as well. And of course, it's really compatible with this sort of auxel nodal approach. Like anything can be made to a context from whether it's a table or a room or an organization or even one word. You could give rights to one word in a certain context. Like, it's super flexible. Like, what would happen if we would give Martin the rights to the word license, and only Martin can mention it, but if he mentions it, then everybody else has rights to it for 5 minutes. I don't know, but it's interesting.
In this sense, I agree. Nice way of triggering me, by the way. I, in this sense, agree also with the earlier part of the discussion that I think much of this is basically opening again possibilities, and like, I mean, I think it's really interesting to think about how these things could become legal, for example, or functioning in a legal environment. But I think it's also just good to kind of blast open certain, imaginative space in order to show a bit the material, maybe to reveal.
I feel referencing to the legal environment is such a volatile thing, because like every place has different legal frameworks, which constantly shift, especially if you look at, sort of the digital oriented discourses / crypto. It sort of feels like regulation and legal frameworks really keep changing accordingly to cases and maybe what the US is doing. And then it's such a time-consuming thing almost to keep up with actual legal frameworks. It feels, at least.
Well, maybe that's what I was meaning to say. That like, just by playing around with things that don't even ambition to be functioning in a quote unquote real world legal environment, you could create, just if it's simply some type of literacy, if it's just kind of a recognition, hey, wait, those are the types of structures that we're anyway moving. Why are they the way they are? Why are they not the way that I imagine, or that I could imagine, or that we could imagine together? And so you do basically two things. You kind of crack open the material to say, so this is how stuff is made, but you also do that in a way that it, at the same time kind of shows how you could, possibly anyway, move around in it and play with it. And I think that's already rather great.
I agree. I don't think, like, still trying to shed my downerisms, I don't think it's as like really like introducing these kind of things into discourse. You don't really have to first think about the law. Like I said, it's cool that there are ways to also avoid it, but also like I don't think you have to take the stress levels too high about it, because every new structure of governance starting from the nation itself wasn't legal when it started. They cannot be, like, by definition. They have to be utopian proposals. So that kind of, and the micronations are in that same space. They are utopian proposals. But on top of that, I'll introduce a couple of possible seeds, which are more like, like offers. Like I was thinking of this sessions, and this, like, from the conversation, what opens up ready to be mutilated by you or rejected also is like, what if we did a session of, like, I could make like probably 2-3 page version of, like, here's the like plain blocks of a nation from oxels, like oxel-like things, and then we could utilize those as kind of playtest or develop different exotic nations. There are a couple of more to the ones I mentioned, like the citizen is a role, and actually kind of utilizing it in an oxel-like role fashion makes it quite flexible. And then this sort of a nation being an organization that spawns other organizations, and there's some others, but and we can, but we don't have to think about enforcement. It's an interesting topic in itself, but we don't necessarily have to get there. So, like, I'll make a stupid name for it, like 2-page nation session, playtest session. That's a possibility, and it might feed towards this sort of oxel-like communication, because it would kind of push a bit such expression, and put minor challenge, but I don't think a too hard a challenge to oxels themselves. That's one. The other one I had, we haven't mentioned genes beyond the name, but I think there is interest to them. And I had this short talk with Pablo, I think, where I was saying that I think the idea works, but if when I express it, it's too clockworky and nitpicky, whatever, like just gets too complicated. So that made me think, because yes, I still agree with this statement, and I like Pablo was agreeing as well, and I think probably agree still. But what if we had a genes like hacking session? Like, let's take this photo and scribble all over it. How does it become a gene, rather than like starting from my clockworky put all concepts and make things difficult kind of way, and use that to kind of flesh out the genes. So rather than starting from ready-made things, like, start to create them, and then think while creating, how do they play? So that's another session, and such throwing these out. Like, one is semi-averse offering, like essentially with the question of how would we offer this idea to people, because I do think the idea is interesting, that you take this, like, ultimately we are in a world of meaning, not just language, but everything becomes meaningful somehow, which is the concept of semiosis, kind of almost traditionally. But then what if we treated this world that we are more like a setting than just a world we accept, which is a very rough way of describing it. But I do think it has some power as a concept. So, and like in practical terms, this could be a short thing to offer, which then interestingly would play like, okay, here's the concept, here's one way to play, but you could also play this ChatGPT version as a kind of reflection on this. So it would be a nice way to frame the game we made as well, or support it.
I would like to say a couple of things to the last things that you just mentioned. Quick thing on the 2-page Nations playtest session. What just a kind of flash of the mind that came to me was like, okay, then you kind of select as citizen of your nation every 100th person if you would list all people on Earth alphabetically. And as new folks get born and are baptized or whatever way they get their name, that list changes all the time. So who's the citizen now and who's the citizen the next second? And so just to kind of fuck with the idea of what's citizenship, who's getting selected and so on. And these types of things, we were talking about like a kit materialized with in whatever fashion, but that would kind of include these types of, fuckeries, like where you can kind of plug together a nation or a little organization that you're running, a residency program or a social space or whatever, decentralized project, where you have to come up with the kind of with the politics of that. And you just use these things and you punch them into each other. Maybe, it's a collage way, or maybe it's a digital, drag and drop thing, or node-based somewhat interface, what doesn't matter. But that you get exactly to these type of things. Then you can just fuck around with stuff that makes them kind of sound differently to you.
I like your comment so much that I quoted you several times. I made fuck with the idea of citizenship, plug-in fuckeries, great term.
It does render my idiom accurately, I would say.
No, it's good because it immediately kind of sparked in my head. And this is what I noticed when you start playing with this very stony concepts and you introduce a way to play with them, things start moving. Like I started like thinking, what is a space where if you stand on a certain spot, you gain the rights of a citizen.
Yeah, exactly.
And when you move from it, you start losing. If you move to a certain
nice.
You lose certain rights. And it's just like, it's so unconventional that it makes you think about, like everything cascades to different changes from that. And
yeah, and I think the potential of that is, you already see it. It's almost kind of, cascade. Cascade is a good thing in the waterfall sense. Yeah. So second thing to the James Pecco, we had a session, I think I know I was part of it because I can talk about it, so I guess I was in there, where you spoke about the James in a way that made me understand almost like for the first time a particular notion about it. And that click came when you said it's grow before flow. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And so the idea was that that the addition of genes. So we had two ways of defining genes. I think that was rather kind of significant, right? The one was that it was a picture with text, so a very formal perspectivation. The other was, and now you have to help me out, Pablo, you might also need to help me out here, that it could be played in a certain way with each other, that it was kind of, what was the other thing though? But the thing somehow made, or that it was in a certain way of access, or so what do I not recall from this? Anyway, the point was that like we ended up, or like I ended up in my head with this kind of chain of memes, right? Pablo, help me, please. Like it was not because until now, the way we've discussed, or the way that we've spoken about this, there was also always one image on the screen. Sometimes you had a few more, but we were always talking about the one. We were not talking about a chain or a succession or an addition of those.
Or constellation.
or constellation. And I think that's what then came to the fore when we spoke about genes. Basically, maybe the best way I can kind of cast it back is like there was maybe the image, there were kind of some trigger element in that, and then there was a trigger element in the language also, and those were kind of composing moves, like adding. So I play a gene now. Let's say, for concreteness sake, it's on Twitter. I play a gene, and somebody comes and plays another gene next to it, and then it begins shaping into a game simply because one fleshes out the universe and one fleshes out the structures. One has basically a collective way of, blowing a game into the universe, right?
Mhm.
Like, is that well described? Please, guys, help me out.
I remember you. There was this moment of realization of the openness of the format, as in constructing through images, but I don't remember specifically how that was phrased.
We need to get better at note taking.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to remember because I remember this conversation. If it was in the group before flow, this was the like sitting on showing from one computer some possibilities and to talk about it, how it could play in practice kind of thing. I think a couple of things that were mentioned there is like the group before flow can start from that you're really playing with this ambiguity. Like, let's say the only thing you have is, I mean, in this case, there were pictures. They could be something else. It's just like easy example is like, and then you put one word on it, but you can play with that already, and then you change it. Somebody else takes it and makes a version of it. They can play that. That was that's kind of like, it doesn't matter if it's ambiguous. It's already playable, which I think is something we've been using actually more and more in all kinds of forms, this ambiguity, and I think it's heavily powerful. But then there was about this sharing, there was a kind of more loose talk of this, like really you're able to take anything from or put anything anywhere, and like, your game is that you quote like 3 tweets or whatever they are, like posts somewhere. But maybe there was something said in more crystallized form, but I'm currently missing it. Trying to help you, but badly, Martin.
Yeah, maybe we get back into it when we start talking about it and we start doing. I think it's yeah. We'll find it back. I think it was kind of very close to what you now said. For the record, I repeated that it was a joint fleshing out of stuff.
Yes.
And that the genes, because I think it's like, maybe I'm recalling now something that we didn't talk about, but maybe it helps still, like that kind of memes in the way they flow through Reddit or Twitter or what, they're basically texty in their way. They're kind of an ongoing, continuous conversation. Either,
Yes.
yeah, of course, that branches out, and so, but it is an ongoing conversation. So I have basically, like on a tape recorder, you have basically one reading head following that thing in time, whereas a gem would be more spatial, would be more kind of worldly in that sense, because it keeps it right. Can one not say that? Like, because it kind of keeps, or seeks at least to keep relation to the ones posted before, if we keep that practical condition in mind also.
Yeah, I now remember parts of that conversation, so this might also help. So one comparison I made because the Glock presentation had been, I made like, think of how the world, or rather the setting, grows in this, that anybody who adds something it kind of can grow the space, and maybe they're forgotten, like maybe somebody or nobody reads them, or maybe they become like somebody starts playing them, they become their own branch, and somebody else starts playing them, they become their own branch. And all of these then, like if they enter back as new versions, can enter to other play. And this has really this sort of more word-like than story-like quality. And I could make another comparison, which at least Martin, you might have a reflection on, because you were part of the quote-unquote D&D game we played in the almost middle of the night, late evening in among
Which
the
is
lab.
great. I'm happy that Rock is still alive.
Yes, like yeah, it was close, um, but the thing is, like, what I would ask in reflection to that as, how does the world grow there? Because like I said, I started from nothing or very little, like material that was fragmentary and so on. But if you think of how the world grows, it doesn't just grow by me. Every comment or every action grows the world itself. And this happens also in micro level, that, okay, you decide to go to that place, it means that that place will grow. Some of your takes on how you approach mean that those will become more detailed in the world itself. And in a way, this gene can steal that kind of operation of growth, that it's really everything that is added to the discussion is like potential, like adding soil to the setting, so to speak. But then creating this sort of like, oh, I captured this item that you had and move it elsewhere. So you have this playful, like, actually you found this item and somebody found a cool picture or whatever the form is and added some notes, but somebody else uses an item in completely different game. And it starts a new, or operates like a seed there and starts a new growth there. And I think it's highly interesting, as it's precisely towards this, that it still has this sort of strong relation to memetics, but rather than being this sort of consumable flow of, I saw a cool meme, now I see another cool meme, but naturally they kind of flow out of like activity. They're consumed. People don't necessarily or usually go back and relook certain memes. They wait for new ones. But here it's different. It's like, oh, like I want a place or a scene, like I'll take this one. It's still in a living form. It's you cannot consume it because it's always playable, and in a new context it could play differently. Which I think is a highly interesting cultural form.
I just added the note there that in thinking about any of those things, but in the dreams now, for example, I think I think we can take the concrete, a kind of substrate of appearance into account, because to my perspective anyway, it distorts material appearance, distorts thoroughly what one is looking at and what possibilities it has and how it can be played and what it is. So like, I think if we speak about genes on a Twitter basis, or if we speak about genes in the way that there's a file on somebody's computer, that makes every difference. That's just two hardly comparable things. And if we speak about them in language, it's again a different thing, because it kind of affords for a certain way of sharing, but not other ways of sharing, etc. So I think it would be nice in this track to kind of keep that thing in mind and test it. That dimension in mind and test
it. Yeah, and as a kind of a challenge, which doesn't have to be followed through, but maybe an interesting challenge to see possibilities in this. This was talked about very shortly in Austria, but like I could see this if somebody offered this as a framework that, hey, this almost like an, hey, here's an RPG maybe offered through crowdfunding or whatever, but it's an RPG that is completely different at the same time, and that and how it would publish is not really necessary, say a book or a PDF, but actually kind of populating certain spaces and inviting people to those spaces, which could be wherever, which could just populate whatever platform, but it would kind of grow this sort of game and also ways of playing it. Like I said, I don't think it's like one has to exactly do that, but it's an interesting thought experiment in this, like how to introduce people to the idea of like playful meaning operating in this way, or playful expression operating in this way.
But that is, for example, a very good reflection on, I think, the way it can materially appear.
Yeah, and I do think like as a framework, it could raise interest. If there people were aware of it in any manner, I think it might be something that would be considered interesting by certain communities.
Yeah. Maybe like, yeah, I don't want to be bumpy. I don't want to throw stuff in at a point that is not maybe necessary. But I was wondering if it would be good still at this point, because what's the time now? 6:45 in Finland, 6:45 in Europe, Central Europe. So I have like 15 minutes more to speak about this, like the way of structuring the exploration of these things. And because I feel like I speak for myself personally, but I make it also kind of, I lift it as a proposition. If we would say that we dedicate any type of container, if we call that a project or whatever we want to be calling it, that would be titled by any of these things that we now spoke about. Let's say the genes is one, the nation fuckery is the other, and then whatever else we want to be kind of discussing, the oxels obviously. And we say, guys, we make a track out of that. And we can then, by that, we could, for example, plan a couple of sessions in succession, saying what could we want to be looking at, and how would we want to be capturing that, and what do we want to be building toward. Just that we kind of, maybe focus or concentrate the practice we have already started in seeking to manifest certain things. And also maybe maybe I leave it at this point. That would be something that I anyway came away with from Austria as one thing we could do now, looking at the next whatever period of operation that we look into now.
I would support the idea of having specific sessions on this for sure.
Mm. I would support it as well, and also like having this sort of, call it an experiment test of creating these kinds of things. I could like even see kind of like starting from the semi-verse, mostly because there could be something offerable from that, from one or maybe two sessions. That's, and I'm not saying that we should or start from there, but that is interesting in itself, like that the cycle of actually getting to something offerable might be quite quick, especially if we kind of are in a mode of let's just put it out there, and then it would have supportive material already in the kind of game that plays with the idea or can be thought of as playing with the idea, even if it's trapped in the GPT 20 euros a month thing. And then like going from there towards this, like selecting from the others. I think like this also connects to, we had this conversation in Austria that, you know, in terms of offering something to the world, we have already like poverty of riches in terms of things that are like kind of figured out but not expressed. Like they have a basis of like it's merely waiting for putting things in an offerable form to give them to people. And if one kind of looks at all of these together, we were mapping this and talking about this. This is a quite a lineup in a way, like very kind of culturally large ideas, but also structures. So it would be interesting to have that. Like if we at some point would arrive to a palette that several of these things, like here's some voxels to play with, here here's the Semiverse, here's Teams as a game, like that's quite a lot, and there are others as well. Like so yeah, like it's I think it's enticing for many reasons, but also for that reason that it would really give an interesting face, which then could increase the communications and mutations by other people encountering them.
Yeah. One thing that crossed my mind now is how about we fix any number of now tracks where we like, that's a good thing, that's a good thing, that's a good thing, and we make a kind of list about that and say, so we're gonna look, and then we can, because we can do that also asynchronously, we can make a schedule and some agenda. Seen and good. We can make a kind of schedule and agenda also together, saying we would want to be doing this and this and this on this and this and this track in the coming so and so. And if we have a document that we could also pitch into, even with hopes and wishes, I think we could also see what seems now to be interesting to all of us. And then we can kind of allocate session time proportionally to that. And then we could also maybe talk about what ways of what types of substrates. I just wrote that note on substrate a bit further up. Maybe that's a nice, I've been using that for myself. Substance is also just good. We would want things to be turned into, because they could also include the kind of, you know, half and half immaterial thing of just a framework thing. So if we would set up such a list as maybe the only thing that we do today, right? We make a kind of number thing where we have all these titles. And then we can maybe make a document, be that even a Google sheet, or maybe that's too much. Maybe a Google Doc is still fine, where then everybody can pitch a bit in. Maybe I could also prepare such a stuff. How does that sound in general?
To be specific, you mean have a session where we decide how much time we will allocate to each thing, and then how we will use that time, kind of.
That I didn't now think about how that would specifically be decided or such a, but like I think what would help me anyway very much would be to say, okay, we have these things that we kind of all agree on we want to be looking into. And then have, I think, a document of sorts into which everybody can throw their ideas, hopes, connections, ambitions, wishes, whatever, underneath those. And then, yeah, I guess we would need to make a kind of decision, or like we were structuring effort together, how we want to put that in time, who wants to take what responsibility, because I think maybe another thing that might be appearing as a potential might be that the preparation effort could be shared. We also kind of a bit talked about that in Austria. So But yeah, for the time being, starting with just fixing a few things where we're like, that's things that XORG ought to be working or could be working on next time. That would be the step number one for me, in my point of view.
I kind of agree. Like I can see kind of pathway like towards this that could be like adding a couple of dynamic touches. Like for example, like all of these things could be produced in many forms, like whether it's a semioverse or oxels or whatever. But then the first things might be like quite openly discuss kind of, one could call them challenges. Like what if we had a short description that was somehow playable, however hackily, of semioverse? That's a challenge. Like that's setting up a goalpost somewhere, which then becomes a potential challenge of creation, production, call it whatever. But this allows to also think about like not just is the idea interesting, but is what is the kind of first like a goalpost of offering it outside, which could be set on many levels, like and also maybe come up with ideas that are easier and lighter, or if that's desired. And then like once we kind of settle on this sort of challenge or a goal that we take, we can like go into whether it's dividing tasks or hey, I could produce this kind of ways towards it. I think all of this would fit with this sort of having its own document, etc., structural approaches. But like facing this question, it's not just the areas, but it's also like, do we find to an area something that is interesting to do, easy enough to do, that it's practically sensible? Because that's other side of the thing itself. Like one idea might be interesting, but then it's a question of figuring out how to make it not too large, like this, not in the sense of this is 1 year project kind of thing.
Sure, but maybe that will, like, if we just kind of for this moment in time, just open contribution across all of us.
Sure.
I think we have quite good way of or good kind of chances. The odds would be fine to kind of figure that out.
Yeah, sure. By Linda, since and Rock, if you want to, like, do you have senses of this, or what do you feel about this? Essentially, like this kind of direction.
It makes sense to me. I mean, we've been discussing about sort of forking all the sub themes and things arising from XOR sessions anyway into more specific themed sessions, definitely. And the sort of, yeah, I guess now it feels a bit late now to sort of start putting those into a list, to me at least, because I'm quite burned out. But that could be the next move. So we sort of really have a list of what everyone sort of would like to develop further or tap into, and then we can sort of sub sort of folks within.
I have a suggestion on that, because I think you might be right on it being too late on the session and it getting tired. What if we open here into this notes document, because everybody has it now, this, I put it at top, like this area called the list. And this is for everyone to write during the next week.
I threw a proposition in there just now.
Yeah, but it's up to anyone now to write their own propositions.
Yeah, super.
That certainly, like, I think that tracks that that you put there are kind of reflecting the conversation, but we can keep this open. My fonts are all over the place. I'll change this just there. Okay, so so yeah, everybody could write suggestions here. so we don't have to do it now, but also we have something before the next session. So that's one possibility. That sounds sensible.
Does it make sense to where one doesn't want to be anonymous, of course, but like to include your kind of PK background, ESR, like initials is the word that I'm looking for, so that we can kind of discuss back.
I mean,
not a must, just to kind of think where it makes sense, like that we have a bit of track on what's happening.
I mean, like if people feel that they want to, I wouldn't make it compulsory. Like if somebody just wants to add,
I said,
yeah, like people can add just if semi-anonymously if they want to, or if they want to put their names, they can put them in. Like I think both can work, because anyway, like I do think like there is something to maybe also personally, like I find it interesting this and much more in a way healthy that ultimately, like it, rather than becoming a fight of who owns and who made such things, there are so many organizations that have been killed by that fight, and also like the life within them is usually kind of worse for it. Is really like trying to sort of like these are XORG offers. Like
sorry, this is a misunderstanding here. Like
no,
I don't mean like this, like, but I do want to say it at this point. This is not about claiming. This is about being able to address in the next session that we have where thought comes from, so that we can discuss it.
Yeah, I know. I know that's what you meant, but like I kind of opened it to more like a general level. I know that you were talking about the practical point. Maybe I should have made that clear, but yeah, like that in a way, like this approach. Ultimately, if we have these things or tracks, that there's this general spirit of working together on them. Like yeah, that's what I'm essentially saying. But
okay, guys, I need to jump off now because we're drumming on the flat, which is really nice. I don't want to miss that moment. So I think I will say bye.
We can all go. I think we have a nice plan.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think if this plan is agreeable, we could go with this. And also, like, it can be taken as a creative exercise of finding, like, what could be an interesting form to offer for these things, and or development path. Like those sessions, for example, can feed, like James. I think actually maybe it doesn't even start with the challenge, but starts with having the session of hacking them together, and maybe that leads to a way of expressing it. So, but yeah, work with that. But I think yes, we're coming to a closure. Like, so any last word from my side? I can apologize of being super tired because this is my crash day apparently. Like it's the first day that I've actually slept well, and as often happens, rather than being super energized, unlike yesterday when I was manic, now I'm just crashed. So apparent that I'm not in the best of general energy levels, but this is not because of you. It's just what life has done to me.
I literally follow you 100% because I'm in this situation, so don't worry. Could have a sleep session next time. I was actually thinking about an artist coin created ages ago that was rewarding people that were sort of staying still in front of the computer. So to value it was called the lazy coin. To value laziness and sort of non-work. There was a tracking motion thing. and they would just reward people. They would just stand still. So yeah, I would be very rich by now if that was the case. But yeah. Ciao, Martin.
Ciao. Any last words, Pablo?
White noise.
That's cheating. I mean, maybe. All right, fine. Yeah, I think next week these kind of tracks could lead to what kind of sessions we want. I don't know how you feel. I know I'm kind of cheating on, but this is a practical point of. I think it would be good to still have like this kind of more general talk short next time, if possible, and then move to do something practical, like playful. I think it's possible that we, even if we come up with topics from here, some of those might be played next time as the major topic. That's an attempt I think could be had. So maybe I can see like you could have this session on what the fuck is this semiverse. I think a substantial session would come from there, or let's hack these genes, or maybe even the nation part of the or the oxels. But yeah, we can, like, if that seems like a good attempt, that we aim to have a short general talk on reflection on this, and then go to some practicalization of them. That might be desirable approach.
Yeah, I was wondering, just to clarify. So I've done some development from on the alike interfaces that I showed you, Pecco and Pablo, which at some point, maybe we can meet again to discuss through them. Is that something that needs to go on the list, or is it something else that we can do separately? I don't know.
That's a good question. Like, in a way, like, I definitely support, like, if you want to put it on the list, put it. Like, it's not outside of this. And also a practical point, it actually might be good to meet on it, because there are some developments that kind of like this sort of offer archipelago structure. I've developed it further, like, which was kind of like in some kind of presence in the unlike. But I've also managed now that, like, there was a playnet proposal from in the play drive, and which is a kind of a community structure for play. Not to say any more about that to keep this short, but anyway, they were looking for a structure, and I kind of proposed a version of with a similar structure for them, and they got really interested. So, which of course could be good, like if maybe that leads to mutual development and so on. So all that to say that maybe there are also practical topics to pursue towards the unlike. But yeah.
Perfect. And I just put it on the list so we can just schedule it in somehow. Cool.
Yes. Okay, now we have used our last words. We don't have that move anymore. So we'll have to do. My heart symbol is on the map somewhere. You have to find it in the map picture. And if you don't find it, then the heart will go underground and grow. All right, I'll press stop the recording.